The unwelcome daughter. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany dining table as Sophia Chen adjusted her simple pearl necklace, a wedding gift from her late grandmother. 6 months had passed since she'd become Mrs. James Blackwood, yet the opulent dining room of the Blackwood estate still felt more like a museum than a home. Every piece of furniture whispered of old money, generations of privilege that stretched back to railroad barons and oil tycoons, a world so far removed from her childhood in her parents' modest flower shop that it might as well have been another planet. "The soup course will be served momentarily," announced Mrs. Henderson, the family's head housekeeper, her voice echoing in the vast space. Sophia nodded gratefully, though she noticed how the woman's eyes barely met hers. Even the staff seemed to sense the invisible hierarchy that placed her somewhere near the bottom, despite her new surname. Margaret Blackwood entered the room like a storm cloud dressed in Chanel. At 62, James's mother possessed the kind of austere beauty that came from generations of careful breeding and expensive maintenance. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her pale blue eyes surveyed the room with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to finding fault. Those eyes lingered on Sophia with barely concealed disapproval. "Sophia, dear." Margaret's voice dripped with false sweetness as she took her seat at the head of the table. "I do hope you've been settling in well, though I imagine it must be quite an adjustment, leaving your quaint little neighborhood for all this." She gestured vaguely at the oil paintings and imported tapestries that adorned the walls. Before Sophia could respond, James entered, straightening his tie. Her husband was handsome in that effortless way of men born to privilege. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident stride that came from never having to question his place in the world. Yet lately, Sophia had noticed something different in his demeanor around his mother, a subtle tension that made his shoulders rigid and his smile forced. "Sorry I'm late," James said, kissing Sophia's cheek before taking his seat. "The board meeting ran longer than expected." He glanced between the two women, and Sophia caught the flicker of concern in his green eyes. These family dinners had become increasingly strained, each one a carefully orchestrated performance where every word carried hidden meaning. Margaret smiled that razor-sharp smile she'd perfected over decades of charity luncheons and society gatherings. "James, darling, I was just telling Sophia how impressed I am with her adaptation to our lifestyle. It must be fascinating for someone from her background to experience how we do things here." The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Sophia felt her cheeks warm, but she'd learned to recognize Margaret's tactics over the past months. The woman never attacked directly. Instead, she employed 1,000 small cuts, each comment designed to highlight the differences between them, to remind Sophia that she was an outsider who would never truly belong. "Mother," James warned quietly, but Margaret waved him off with a perfectly manicured hand. "Oh, don't be so sensitive, dear. I'm simply making conversation." She turned back to Sophia, her smile never wavering. "I was telling Mrs. Rothschild at the club yesterday about your artistic pursuits. She found it quite charming that you paint flowers. Such a sweet hobby for a young woman." Sophia gripped her water glass a little tighter. Margaret knew perfectly well that botanical illustration wasn't a hobby. It was Sophia's profession, one that had earned her recognition in several prestigious galleries before her marriage. But in Margaret's world, anything that involved actual work rather than inherited wealth was automatically diminished to the status of a pleasant pastime. "I'm glad she found it charming," Sophia replied evenly, proud that her voice remained steady. "Art has always been important to me." "Of course, dear. Though I do hope marriage will help you focus on more substantial pursuits." The Blackwood women have always been known for their philanthropic leadership, their ability to move in the right circles and support the right causes. Margaret's eyes glittered with challenge. "It requires a certain natural refinement that simply can't be taught. The message was crystal clear. Sophia lacked the breeding, the instinctive understanding of their world that would make her truly worthy of the Blackwood name. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw tightening, but he remained silent. That silence spoke volumes. Even her own husband wouldn't defend her against his mother's subtle cruelty. Mrs. Henderson appeared with the first course, a delicate butternut squash soup garnished with micro herbs. Sophia focused on the presentation, appreciating the artistry even as her stomach churned with hurt and frustration. She'd grown up in a home filled with love and laughter, where her parents celebrated her achievements and encouraged her dreams. This cold formality, this constant sense of being measured and found wanting, was slowly suffocating her spirit. But as she lifted her spoon, Sophia made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't let Margaret Blackwood break her. She had something the older woman would never understand, the strength that came from building something from nothing, the resilience born of genuine struggle and earned success. Margaret might have the advantage of birthright and social position, but Sophia had something far more powerful, the unshakable knowledge of her own worth. The real test, she knew, was yet to come. The storm-brewing Margaret Blackwood stood before her walk-in closet, selecting the perfect armor for tonight's battle. The annual Blackwood Foundation Gala was more than a charity event. It was a demonstration of power, a carefully choreographed display of the family's social dominance. Tonight, she would remind everyone, especially that little flower painter, exactly what it meant to be a true Blackwood. She chose her grandmother's emerald necklace, the one that had graced the throats of railroad heiresses and oil baronesses. Each stone caught the light like a green fire, matching the cold calculation in her eyes. Margaret had built her reputation on reading people, understanding their weaknesses, and tonight she would expose Sophia's greatest vulnerability, her complete inability to navigate high society. The ballroom of the Metropolitan Club buzzed with the cream of the city's elite. Politicians mingled with tech moguls, while society matrons exchanged gossip behind painted fans. Margaret surveyed her kingdom with satisfaction, noting how naturally she commanded attention. This was her element, the world she'd been born to. Rule. She spotted Sophia across the room, looking painfully out of place in a simple black dress that, while elegant, lacked the designer pedigree that everyone else wore like a badge of honor. James stood beside his wife, handsome in his tuxedo, but Margaret could see the tension in his posture. He knew what was coming. "Margaret, darling." Victoria Pemberton, the city's most influential art patron, glided over with her usual dramatic flair. "The gala is absolutely magnificent, and I simply must tell you how intrigued I am by your new daughter-in-law." "James mentioned she's an artist?" Margaret's smile sharpened. "Oh yes, Sophia has such quaint little talents. She paints flowers, you know, quite detailed work, though I'm afraid it's more craft than fine art." She let the words hang in the air like poison gas. "Of course, we're hoping marriage will help her discover more meaningful pursuits." Victoria's eyebrows rose with interest. The woman thrived on social drama, and Margaret was serving it up on a silver platter. How fascinating. "I do hope she understands the responsibilities that come with the Blackwood name." "I'm sure she's learning," Margaret replied, her voice carrying just enough doubt to plant seeds of gossip. "Though breeding does tell, doesn't it? Some things simply cannot be taught." As the evening progressed, Margaret orchestrated her campaign with military precision. She ensured Sophia was seated at the head table, but positioned her next to the most intimidating society matrons, women who could freeze blood with a glance and dissect reputations with surgical precision. She watched with satisfaction as Sophia struggled to keep up with conversations about charity boards she'd never heard of, family connections that went back centuries, and social protocols as complex as international diplomacy. The moment arrived during the silent auction presentation. Margaret had arranged for Sophia to be asked about the evening's art collection, knowing full well that her daughter-in-law's expertise in botanical illustration would seem quaint compared to the abstract expressionist pieces on display. "Mrs. Blackwood," called out Harrison Whitmore, the evening's auctioneer and a long-time family friend, "I understand you have quite the artistic eye. What's your impression of tonight's Rothko?" Sophia stood slowly, every eye in the ballroom turning to assess her. Margaret felt a thrill of anticipation. This was it, the moment when everyone would see exactly what she saw. A simple girl from a simple background who had no business carrying the Blackwood name. "I find Rothko's work deeply moving," Sophia began, her voice carrying farther than Margaret expected. "His use of color creates an emotional landscape that speaks to something primal in the human experience. Though I must admit, my training in botanical illustration has taught me to appreciate the technical mastery required for such apparent simplicity." Margaret's smile faltered slightly. That wasn't the stammering response she'd anticipated. "How interesting," Harrison continued, clearly engaged. "And how does your botanical work inform your appreciation of fine art?" "Both require an understanding of light, composition, and the ability to capture essence rather than just appearance," Sophia replied, her confidence growing. "Whether I'm painting the delicate structure of an orchid or viewing Rothko's meditation on color, I'm looking for that moment when technique transcends into truth." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Margaret felt her carefully laid plans beginning to crumble, but she wasn't finished yet. "How lovely," Margaret interjected, her voice cutting through the positive response like a blade. "Though I do hope our guests won't mistake enthusiasm for expertise. After all, there's quite a difference between painting pretty pictures and understanding the cultural significance of museum-quality art." The ballroom fell silent. Margaret's words hung in the air like a slap, their cruelty unmistakable. She saw James's face flush with anger, watched Sophia's shoulders tense with hurt. This was the moment she'd been building toward, the public humiliation that would put Sophia firmly in her place. But instead of crumbling, something unexpected happened. Sophia straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and smiled with a grace that made Margaret's calculated cruelty look petty and small. "You're absolutely right, Margaret," Sophia said, her voice steady and clear. "There is a significant difference. And I think it's time I shared something with all of you that illustrates exactly what that difference means." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't going according to plan at all. Part 3. Seeds of Strength. Sophia felt the weight of 300 expectant gazes, but for the first time since entering the Blackwood world, she felt truly at home. This was her moment, not the one Margaret had orchestrated, but the one she'd been building toward for months in secret. The ballroom's crystal chandeliers caught the light in her eyes as she stepped forward, transforming from victim to victor in a single breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sophia began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had found their purpose, "Margaret is correct that there's a difference between creating art and understanding its cultural significance. That's exactly why I've spent the past year developing something I call the Botanical Renaissance Project." She gestured to James, who, despite his confusion, moved to assist her. From beneath the auction table, she retrieved a leather portfolio she'd hidden earlier, along with a small potted plant that seemed almost absurdly simple in this grand setting, until she began to speak about it. "This is Heliotropium arborescens, common heliotrope, found growing in a vacant lot in the Riverside district. Most people would call it a weed." She held up the unremarkable purple flower. "But 3 months ago, this little plant became the cornerstone of a project that's about to transform how we think about urban renewal, environmental justice, and the intersection of art and social change." Margaret shifted uncomfortably, sensing the narrative slipping away from her control. The society crowd leaned forward, genuinely intrigued despite themselves. Sophia opened her portfolio, revealing detailed botanical illustrations that made even the most jaded art collectors catch their breath. But these weren't mere pretty pictures. They were technical diagrams, ecological maps, and artistic renderings that told a story of urban transformation. The Botanical Renaissance Project identifies abandoned urban spaces and transforms them into community gardens using native plants that can thrive in contaminated soil, Sophia continued, her passion evident in every word. Each garden is designed as both functional green space and living art installation, with my botanical illustrations serving as educational guides for the communities that tend them. Victoria Pemberton, who had participated in Margaret's earlier character assassination, now stared at the portfolio with genuine amazement. These are extraordinary, Sophia. The technical precision combined with artistic beauty. I've never seen anything quite like it. Thank you, Sophia smiled warmly. But the real beauty lies in what we've accomplished. Working with Dr. Maria Santos from the Environmental Science Institute and partnering with the city's Housing Development Authority, we've successfully established 17 community gardens in the past 8 months. Each one provides fresh produce for local food banks, creates green jobs for residents, and serves as an educational center for children. She turned to another page, revealing photographs of vibrant gardens where concrete lots once stood, families working together among flowering plants, children learning to identify native species through her illustrated guides. The ballroom erupted in murmurs of genuine admiration. Margaret's carefully constructed narrative of Sophia's inadequacy was crumbling in real time, replaced by the undeniable evidence of extraordinary achievement. Harrison Whitmore stepped forward, his earlier condescension replaced by professional respect. Mrs. Blackwood, this is remarkable work. The combination of artistic excellence, scientific rigor, and social impact. The harvest of truth. James Blackwood had spent 35 years of his life walking the careful line between duty and desire, between family loyalty and personal integrity. But as he watched his wife transform his mother's cruel ambush into a moment of triumph, something fundamental shifted inside him. The applause for Sophia's revelation still echoed in the ballroom, but all he could hear was the sound of his own conscience finally finding its voice. He looked at his mother, standing, rigid in her designer gown, her face a mask of barely controlled fury and dawning realization. Margaret had built her identity around being the most formidable woman in the room, the one who controlled narratives and shaped opinions. Tonight, she'd been outclassed by someone she'd dismissed as insignificant, and the recognition was written in the tight lines around her eyes. But it was Sophia who commanded James's attention. She stood surrounded by admirers, graciously answering questions about soil pH levels and native plant species, with the same poise she'd once used to discuss the delicate brushwork required to capture morning dew on a petal. This was the woman he'd fallen in love with, not despite her humble origins, but because of the strength those origins had forged within her. "Quite a remarkable woman you married." Harrison Whitmore appeared at James's elbow, his voice warm with genuine admiration. "I must admit, I expected something rather different based on your mother's introduction." The words hit like a physical blow. James realized with sickening clarity how many times he'd remained silent while his mother's subtle cruelty chipped away at Sophia's confidence. How many dinner parties where he'd watched his wife endure veiled insults and said nothing. How many moments when his silence had been interpreted as agreement with his mother's assessment. "Yes, she is remarkable," James replied, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Excuse me." He made his way through the crowd, each step feeling like a choice between the man he'd been raised to be and the man he wanted to become. When he reached Sophia's side, she turned to him with a smile that held no trace of victory or vindication, only the warm affection that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "James," she said softly, touching his arm, "I hope you don't mind that I didn't tell you about the project. I wanted to be sure it was going to succeed before—" "Before what?" he interrupted, his voice louder than intended. Several nearby conversations paused. "Before you trusted me enough to share something this important. Before you believed I would support your work instead of dismissing it like everyone else in my family." Sophia's eyes widened with surprise at the pain in his voice. "James, that's not—" "It is," he said, taking her hands in his. "God help me, Sophia, it absolutely is. I've spent our entire marriage letting you face my mother's attacks alone, because I was too much of a coward to choose between family peace and defending my wife." The conversations around them had stopped entirely now, even Margaret still standing. Near the auction table, like a general surveying a lost battlefield, turned to watch her son's public declaration. "Do you know what I saw tonight when you stood up to respond to my mother's cruelty?" James continued, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "I saw the woman I fell in love with. Brilliant, compassionate, strong enough to turn an attack into an opportunity to showcase work that puts everything my family has ever accomplished to shame." He turned to address the room, but his words were meant for his mother. "For months, I've watched the most accomplished woman I've ever known be treated like an interloper in her own home. I've listened to suggestions that she lacks refinement, that her background makes her unsuitable for our family name." Margaret's face had gone pale, but James wasn't finished. "Tonight proved something I should have recognized from the beginning. Sophia doesn't need to prove she's worthy of the Blackwood name. The Blackwood name needs to prove it's worthy of her." The ballroom was completely silent now, the weight of James's words settling over the crowd like snow. He had just publicly rebuked his mother, the social queen of their world, in front of everyone who mattered in their circle. "While we've been hosting charity galas and writing checks to feel good about ourselves, my wife has been out there actually changing lives. She's taken her artistic talent and used it to create something that feeds hungry families, teaches children about their environment, and transforms neighborhoods that the rest of us drive through without seeing." He looked directly at Margaret now, his voice gentling but losing none of its steel. "That's what class looks like, Mother. Not the ability to intimidate someone at a dinner party, but the grace to transform that attack into an opportunity to showcase work that makes the world better. Not the accident of birth, but the choice to use your gifts in service of others." Margaret's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she found herself genuinely speechless. James turned back to Sophia, lifting her hand to his lips in a gesture that was both tender and defiant. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find my voice. I'm sorry you had to fight these battles alone, but I promise you that ends tonight." The applause that followed was different from what had greeted Sophia's presentation. Deeper, more personal. These people weren't just appreciating charitable work. They were witnessing a marriage transformed, a man choosing love over legacy, courage over comfort. But the most important sound in that ballroom wasn't the applause. It was the soft intake of breath from Margaret Blackwood as she finally began to understand what she'd been too blind to see. Her son hadn't married beneath himself. He had married a woman whose quiet strength made him better than he'd ever imagined he could be. Part 5. Blooming Together. 3 months after the gala, Sophia stood in the morning light filtering through the conservatory windows of what had once been Margaret Blackwood's private retreat. The older woman had offered the space without fanfare, a gesture that spoke louder than any apology could have. Now it served as Sophia's studio and the unofficial headquarters of the Botanical Renaissance Project, which had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The conservatory hummed with quiet activity. Local art students worked alongside environmental science graduate students, creating educational materials for the expanding network of community gardens. On the far wall, Sophia's latest series of botanical illustrations traced the complete life cycle of urban soil rehabilitation, from contaminated wasteland to thriving ecosystem. "The mayor's office called," James said, entering with 2 cups of coffee and the morning newspaper folded under his arm. "They want to discuss expanding the program to 12 more districts." Sophia looked up from her easel, where she was putting the finishing touches on a detailed study of Taraxacum officinale, common dandelion, the most resilient of urban plants. 12 more districts means we'll need additional funding for soil testing and community coordinators. "Already handled," James smiled, settling into the chair he'd claimed as his own. The Blackwood Foundation voted unanimously to make Botanical Renaissance our primary charitable focus for the next 5 years, full funding for expansion, plus endowment funds to ensure the program's sustainability. The transformation in their marriage had been as dramatic as the transformation of the abandoned lots they rehabilitated. James had resigned from 2 corporate boards to spend more time supporting Sophia's work, discovering in the process that he had a genuine talent for grant writing and community outreach. Their relationship had evolved from the polite partnership of a society marriage into something deeper, a true collaboration built on shared purpose and mutual respect. "Your mother voted for that?" Sophia asked, though she already knew the answer from James's expression. "She didn't just vote for it, she proposed it." The sound of footsteps on the conservatory's stone floor announced Margaret's arrival. The older woman entered carrying a small potted plant and wearing an expression that had become increasingly common over the past months, a mixture of humility and genuine interest that had replaced her previous imperious certainty. "Sophia, dear," Margaret said, and the endearment now carried warmth instead of condescension, "I brought you something I thought you might find interesting." She set the pot on Sophia's work table. Inside was a small orchid with delicate white blooms marked by purple veins, clearly expensive and meticulously cared for. "It's beautiful," Sophia said, genuinely touched. "What's the occasion?" Margaret's smile held a hint of her old mischief, but now it was directed at herself rather than others. "I realized I've been surrounded by rare and expensive plants my entire life without ever really seeing them. I thought perhaps you could teach me to look at them the way you do." The request represented a complete reversal of their original dynamic. Margaret Blackwood, who had once dismissed Sophia's botanical expertise as a quaint hobby, was now asking to learn from her daughter-in-law's knowledge. "Good," Margaret said firmly. "I've spent too many years only noticing things that were supposed to matter instead of things that actually do matter." James watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction. The past months had brought changes he'd never imagined possible. His mother had been